11:30. I think with that overview, I think I'm going to hand over to Mamaponya Motsai, who is the CEO of Frey College, to give her welcome remarks.
Thank you so much for that, Bridget, and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for taking of your time to join us. To the participants who've already arrived, we're so excited that you could join us this morning. Like Bridget said, I think in the registration we had over 40 people from over 40 countries in Africa and outside of Africa registered to join this webinar, and we certainly hope that most of those people will join us. But we're really excited and really glad that you thought this is something that is worth your time, and we have no doubt that the insights that you get today will definitely be worth your time. And I also want to thank our speakers who will be speaking to us today. Thank you, Professor Rachel Jukes, for joining us, for agreeing to come and be with us and share your research and your knowledge and your insight with storytellers. We have storytellers from different parts of the continent. We have invited people from civil society, journalists, student journalists, social media influencers. So we're really excited that you get to share with all of us, Professor Jukes, your insights and the work that you've been doing. Thank you also to our panelists who will be in discussion with me later today. I'm excited about that. Thank you for joining us, and I'll introduce everyone later. Thank you to our partner, GIZ. So as Bridget mentioned, so this is part of launching an e-course that will be made freely available for newsrooms across the continent. I mean, we will start slowly in South Africa, but certainly the idea is to make it as widely available as possible across the continent to newsrooms and journalism schools. And that would not be possible without our partner GIZ. So GIZ has been, this is part of their program, Partnerships for Prevention of Gender-Based Violence in Southern Africa, and they have provided us with enormous support, financial and otherwise, ideas and resources, and so we're really grateful for that. Thank you, GIZ, and Begonia will tell us more about that work when she speaks after me. So thank you all for joining us. And for us, this is very important. So just quickly, if I can share just a little bit about the e-course, I'll share a little bit more before the panel. But as part of developing this e-course, we did a survey where we were asking people in the newsrooms and journalism schools what kind of training is provided for journalists and journalism students for reporting on gender-based violence. And this is because reporting on gender-based violence is one of the modules in this e-course. So the e-course deals with issues of gender sensitivity in the newsroom, in our news, but also how we report on gender-based violence. And when we were asking what kind of training, many of them said there wasn't any structured or formal long-term training they have in terms of reporting on gender-based violence. And yet we know, and we can all agree, that gender-based violence is a crisis. But how is it a crisis when we are not, and then we are not meeting it as such? So this course for us is very important. The fact that only about 23% of the people who make news are women, even despite the fact that most of our populations are majority women, only 23% of the people who are sources in news are women. The fact that, we know the stats of gender-based violence, we know the stats of what happens in our newsrooms, and how even at leadership positions, it's difficult to sustain women leaders in leadership positions in newsrooms. All of those things, and the fact that, I was just reading up about the cases of rape used as a weapon of war in Tigray in the war that ended in Ethiopia a few years ago. And the stats are shocking. Over 100,000 women raped, gang raped, used in sexual slavery. You know, in South Africa, we know these stats only too well. Thousands of women die every year from femicide from their partners. And this is the same in many countries. And these issues, what happens in the newsrooms in terms of gender sensitivity and gender-based violence, they are caused by the same system. And so this ECOS provides all of us with understanding of what the issues are and how we can all be part of the solution. And we are honored to have Professor Jukes, who will talk to us more about the causes of gender-based violence. But you know, this is something that we hope that as many newsrooms as possible will take up as part of their HR policies, and many news journalism schools will take up as modules for their students, because we do need to talk about and we do need to institutionalize gender sensitivity and how we report on gender-based violence. I'm going to stop there in terms of just giving us a little brief. I'll talk a little bit more about the course as an intro to the panel, but welcome everyone and thank you for joining us. And I really hope that you find that some of these things that we talk about today, you can already start using in your reporting and in your storytelling. Bridget, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Mama Ponya, and welcome to all the new participants that are joining as well. I'd like to now invite our partners to give some opening remarks. We have with us Begonia Castro Vasquez, who's the Program Manager of the Regional Project Partnerships for Prevention of Gender-Based Violence in Southern Africa. That's the PFP program, implemented with its partners by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, that's GIZ, on behalf of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. Begonia is a lawyer with a master's in international cooperation and postgraduate studies in gender, society, and politics. She has over 17 years of experience working in Europe, Latin America, Asia Pacific, and Southern Africa, mainly on promoting women's rights. Before joining GIZ, she also worked at UNDP and UN Women. So over to you, Begonia, for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me here today. Thanks to the participants also for joining this important discussion on gender-sensitive reporting. And again, a special thanks to our partners and you organizers. As it was mentioned before, gender-based violence is being a serious social problem in South Africa for many years, and in the region and globally, unfortunately. There was a recent study that was launched here in South Africa called the First South African National Gender-Based Violence Study. Perhaps Professor Rachel Jukes will also mention it, and the figure came up as 35.5% of women in South Africa reported having experienced physical and or sexual violence during their lifetime. And against this background, the government of South Africa approved some years ago the National Strategic Plan on GBV and Femicide that will be in place until 2030. With 6 pillars in place, so 6 priorities or 6 ways how the government wants to coordinate the response to the scourge of gender-based violence. And within these 6 pillars, pillar number 2 focuses on gender-based violence prevention. Central to prevention and endeavors is tackling harmful social norms, attitudes, and behaviors, as these are some of the key drivers of gender-based violence. And therefore, we need to focus on these in order to accelerate primary prevention. And in this regard, since 2017, GIZ has been implementing the program Partnerships for Prevention of Gender-Based Violence in Southern Africa. And as it was mentioned already, the program is funded by the German government, and it aims at preventing GBV before it happens, or if it has already happened, to prevent its reoccurrence in the SADC region. And particularly here in South Africa, the work that we do includes also working with the media to bring about change and alter social norms and practices that perpetuate gender-based violence. And we do that because we understand that mainstream media has the potential to facilitate this social shift from just being aware of gender-based violence and making strides to making strides towards accountability. However, literature shows that gender-blind reporting remains a challenge, as some of the media stories that we see in the press or on TV or social media are still trivializing experiences of gender-based violence victims and continue to be told from a very narrow range viewpoints. Very often, the way how media speaks about gender-based violence misses analysis or insights of the different implications for men and women. And especially it misses the points of victims and its roots causes. And this is why we think that it is important for journalists to write about gender-based violence in a manner that it is sensitive to gender inequalities and that portrays women and men fairly. It's also important to address the structural barriers that social norms that perpetuate and continue to legitimize gender-based violence. Well-balanced, sensitive, and transformative narratives can impact society and public responses to gender-based violence. It can change the perception and the treatment of survivors, and it supports advocacy efforts. So to support this critical function of the media, PFP, which is how we called in short the Partnership for Prevention program, together with key media stakeholders, we implement these several flagship projects that aim to achieve behavior change within the media and the creative industries to create more gender-sensitive, unstereotyped, and equal and positive change-driven content, as well as creating also safe and equal production environment behind the scenes. And so actually we have been working in this field already for a while. And from 2018 until 2022, we, together with our partners, and also at that time together with UN Women, we implemented a successful flagship. We call it Step It Up, to engage with media. And as a result of that work, we were enhancing the capacity of news and entertainment media practitioners to produce content that is gender and GBV sensitive and does not stereotype and re-victimize survivors or victims of gender-based violence. And as a result of that work, we developed the Step It Up Gender Sensitivity Reporting Training Manual, and subsequent to that, the Gender Sensitivity Training for Media Practitioners. And at that time, media institutions also committed to a call to action to report on and to cover GBV in a sensitive manner, as well as to create safer space and equal working conditions for media practitioners. So building on successes and recommendations of the implementation of the Step It Up initiative, now PFP is implementing work with the media that seeks to sustain this media capacity in gender-sensitive response, and to mobilize also technical resources for journalists to accurately report on the progress to implement the National Strategic Plan to prevent gender-based violence and femicide, while also promoting journalist safety against cyberbullying to ensure their protection from harassment, which is fundamental to ensure their freedom of speech. And coming to an end, to the end of my welcoming remarks, I want to welcome you today during the panel discussion and throughout the program and the Q&A sessions to share the experience, to deliberate on ways to tell GBV stories with empathy, with accuracy, with respect for survivors, and at the same to make an effort to highlight the complexities of this pervasive issue in our societies. Let us work together to create a more informed and compassionate media landscape that supports survivors and media practitioners and that promotes a meaningful change. Thank you very much for your time and your interest here today. And I hand over back to you, Bridget. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Begonia, for your introductory words and for outlining some of the challenges we face. And we are grateful for for the support for some of the initiatives that you are implementing aimed at realizing the changes we need in media and society. So I think without further ado, we move to the element of our program for our keynote address. We have invited Professor Rachel Jukes to speak to us about understanding the causes of GBV and the role of media in driving change. Professor Rachel Jukes is the executive scientist in the South African Medical Research Council. She's a medical doctor and a specialist in public health medicine. She has led the South Africa Medical Research Council's Gender and Health Research Program for 30 years. She's a founder member of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, and from 2013 to 2020 was a consortium director of the UK aid-funded What Works to Prevent Violence global program, leading research on the prevention of violence against women in 13 countries. She's a member of the Global Program Advisory Committee of the UN Trust Fund, Leadership Council of the Sexual Violence Research Initiative, and a member of the WHO's Expert Advisory Panel on Injury and Violence Prevention and Control. She's also the author of over 300 publications. Thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Jukes. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Well, thank you very much. I want to start, of course, by thanking you for organising this webinar today, and thank you very much, everybody, for attending. I'm delighted to be able to talk about this incredibly important topic, and I hope you can see I'm sharing my screen. I'm also particularly delighted that we have such a wide representation of people attending from different countries in Africa. And I want to start by apologising if what I say is somewhat South Africa centric, because this is where I live and work. I think it's really important to, we have very valuable experiences in South Africa to share, but it's also important to understand the diversity across the continent. And one of the things I see as key when thinking about reporting gender-based violence is to think about the position of the storyteller, the writer, the reporter in this, and to ask the question about whether the role is just to put the story out there, to give people the information and the headlines, or whether the role is to build greater understanding of the problem of gender-based violence, or to go beyond that to actually change the situation for women living in our countries, many of whom experience gender-based violence, whichever country we live in across this continent. And I like to see the role of reporters as being all of those, but really trying to stretch out and think about what is the role of a reporter as a social change agent. And I think that's really important when we work on gender-based violence. It's a subject it's impossible to be neutral about. One can report giving facts around a situation, but it's impossible to describe the abuse of women at the hands of men in their lives, for the most part, although we recognise that women sometimes play a role in the abuse of women as well, without wanting to do something about it, to end the abuse of women, to change the circumstances of the lives for women who experience it. So I think that this is a key thing. And when I put my headline up saying moving beyond the shocking headlines, I don't want to diminish the shocking headlines, because I know that we live in different countries where our population is at a different stage of thinking about GBV. And in a country like South Africa, we've really had the spotlight on GBV for just about 30 years. We do not have to do a big task around basic awareness raising, because actually the level of awareness of GBV is really high in our communities. So what we need to do is to stretch beyond that, to build understanding and to feed into that agenda for change. I think there are other countries in the continent where the level of understanding of GBV and recognition within communities is much lower. GBV is much more shrouded within the kind of veil of secrecy. And in those settings, I think putting it out there and just helping people understand that this isn't a private issue, that this is something that it's a matter for the society. It's a matter that should be engendering social outrage across the society, and we need to break the silence and talk about it. That in itself is a really valuable role. So sometimes I think the shocking headlines really have an incredibly important end in themselves. And I also think it is really important to acknowledge the suffering that so many women go through. And sometimes big headlines are the way of pointing the spotlight on that. So I think the key question is to think about your setting. We also need to think about what we mean by gender-based violence, because there are different forms of gender-based violence. In a lot of the work we do in South Africa, we really focus on what you could call intimate partner violence, violence against women directed at them from their husband or from a boyfriend. We focus on rape, which can be from a partner, very often from a non-partner in our community. We don't talk about sexual harassment at work very much, but it's a very important form of gender-based violence. We still have lots of situations at work in South Africa, and I know more so in other countries, where women are expected to have sex with men who are leaders of teams in the workplace or in very senior positions. Incredibly important that we talk about this. It's much, much less common that this actually reaches the headlines. Sexual abuse of girls. In countries outside South Africa, female genital mutilation and other harmful traditional practices. So we need to be clear. I'm mainly going to talk about intimate partner violence today. And I want to show you this slide, which is about the drivers of intimate partner violence. And after you have put up there the eye-catching headline, "Describe the story of intimate partner violence," I think building an understanding of why we're facing this in our communities is absolutely critical. And I've tried to summarize this in this slide. In South Africa, we're getting much better about talking about the role of patriarchy in driving intimate partner violence, male privilege, male entitlement, and the disempowerment of women. We've had a programme in South Africa for 30 years now to try and empower women and try and break the ceilings that stop women being able to play a meaningful role in the boardroom, in the council chamber, in parliament, across our society. But we still have a massive problem of gender inequality. And I know that this is very much greater in other settings. But there's another factor that we never seem to talk about, which is that one of the drivers of gender-based violence is the fact that in so many different ways within our communities, violence is normative. When we're angry with our neighbour, when we think they've stolen our chicken, we go and thump them. When our child's been naughty, we slap the child. When a child hasn't done their homework at school, teachers beat them. We know in South Africa, beating children at school has been illegal for 25 years. It's still reported to take place in 70% of our schools. So violence is normative. And we need to help people understand that there is an insurmountable contradiction between saying that GBV is wrong, but it's okay to beat children, beat your neighbour, and beat criminals in the street and engage in other forms of violence. We need to move towards thinking that violence is unacceptable within our social relations. And I think it is incredibly important that we look at the way that the use of violence is normalised in our societies. The other really important structural factor I've got here is poverty and low levels of education. And we know that this also permeates all of our societies. South Africa is lucky, we're a middle income country, and we know we have a middle class that is much less poor than the rest of the population. But we have dire poverty within the communities that most people within this country live in. And this leads to incredibly limited opportunities, low levels of education, frustration, low levels of poor mental health, and fuels many of the other drivers that operate at an individual level that fuel the problem of gender-based violence within our society. So it's not all about these big picture things of poverty and gender inequality. There are also individual level factors, because at the end of the day, we know that there are some things that make some people more likely to be violent than other people. So the one thing that is really important is experience of child abuse and trauma in childhood. And in South Africa, another aspect of that is the fact that men are largely absent from our homes and from playing a positive role in child rearing. And that means that there isn't a positive role, particularly for boys, as they're growing up. And to the extent that we have men in homes, very often the role that they perform within a family is a negative role. It's a role of showing male entitlement, male privilege, often male alcohol abuse and violence. So the role of men and how they perform it within families is incredibly important. But we know that our risk of violence, whether we're going to perpetrate it or whether we're going to experience it, is set in place quite largely by what we experience in childhood. If we grow up witnessing our mother being beaten, we're much more likely to see violence as normative within relationships. We're much more likely to think that we can use violence in other settings. But it also impacts our mental health as children, that makes us much less likely to form healthy relationships within our peer group at school. We're much more likely to struggle at school and have problems. And our mother also experiencing violence is greatly impaired from being able to play the full role of a nurturing and supporting mother who can help bring up children or raise children who have a healthy mental outlook. And so we set in place, by the abuse of women, a cycle of trauma that will pass through different generations, fueled by the impact on mental health, often the resort to substance abuse, particularly alcohol, as a way of dealing with mental health problems, or as a way of, for boys, of getting together with friends and establishing peer relations and solidarity. And all of this fuels, when we have relationships, circumstances of greater conflict over drinking, conflict over lack of money, and conflict that ends up being resolved through the use of violence. So it's incredibly important to understand these individual and relationships level factors that quite largely are driven and fueled by experience of violence, abuse and trauma in childhood. I've also put down here the apartheid legacy. In South Africa, we know that the normative use of violence, the impoverishment of our population, and the very abnormal families that we have are quite largely a legacy of apartheid that 30 years on, we're still really grappling with. And in other settings, we know that these problems are driven by conflict, which so often has riven our communities. I think it's really important that we try and put all of these drivers on the agenda. There's been a lot of pushback in South Africa against a lobby to try and link alcohol with gender-based violence. But we know that alcohol is a phenomenal fueler of gender-based violence, and it often very underlies some of the most severe violence that leads to the murder of women within our communities by their partner. South Africa and our neighbour Namibia have some of the highest levels of drinking alcohol per head of population found in the entire world. And it is something that is absolutely critical that we deal with as part of trying to reduce gender-based violence. And we need our journalists and storytellers to be able to talk about these things, to make sure that the finger is pointed to all of these different aspects of the problem. Because government has a big role in things like regulating access to alcohol and the price that alcohol is sold at. And it's really important that we try and make our governments accountable and bring them to the table in terms of addressing GBV. But I also want to talk about how we tell the stories. It's really important to tell the story of the victim of violence. But we don't only want to do that. We must be moving to tell more stories of the survivor. So what are the missing stories? I think the media's got a really important role to play in helping people understand how they can get out of violent relationships. In South Africa, we have protection orders. I know they're not found within the legislation in every country in Africa, but it's really important. There's a kind of sloppy journalism which says, oh, well, a woman dies when she's got a protection order, she's killed by her partner, so protection orders are useless. Protection orders aren't useless, actually. Protection orders are an incredibly important plank of our armoury in trying to protect women from violent partners. And in fact, our research has shown that when women experience very severe IPV, it's only about 1 in 20 who, when they get protection order, find it doesn't either positively impact the level of violence they experience, either by stopping it, reducing it, or at worst, make it no change. So the proportion of women who experience more violence with a protection order is very small. We need to start telling these stories because these tools exist in many of our countries, but we don't really use the media to tell women how to get them. We need to start telling the stories about women ending relationships with violent men and turning their lives around. In South Africa, we have a lot of heroes in our communities, particularly our small rural communities. People who very often have experienced violence themselves, who go out and network with other women who are experiencing abuse to try and help them get out of violent relationships. I think we need to talk about that. There's an astonishing amount that goes on within communities we don't really hear about. We need to start talking about the stories of how women can become resilient when they try and leave, to men pleading that they will go back into relationships. Men are almost scripted when they do this. They say, I've changed. Please forgive me. I'll never do it again. I've learned my lesson. I love you. Nobody else could understand and love me in the way that you do. We have to carry on our relationship. They always say the same thing. I think we need to start outing them in the media so that we can help women resist this type of pressure. Because at the end of the day, for very many women, particularly in South Africa, really ending violence involves leaving relationships with violent men. And I think it's really incredibly important that we put that on the agenda very clearly. I also want us to start talking about stories of stigma, because stigma of being in a violent relationship makes it incredibly difficult for women to speak out to their family members and get support. And also in many communities, there's stigma of leaving. A finger's pointed at the woman experiencing IPV. Either she did something to bring it on herself, or if she leaves a violent man, she's harming the children or giving the family a bad name. The family will become known as a family of women who return to them, and that will harm the prospects of other girls and women in the family. I think it's really important that we talk about the stigma that women face, because it's part of the process of enabling women to be able to leave and walk out of violent relationships. We need to start telling stories of families uniting to deal with the issue of violent men in their ranks, because that's one of the things that has to happen. But all of the men who beat and kill women come from families. And how do families deal with that? We really need to address this, because it's known that certain men are violent within families, and yet the number of times where families will close a door to a man and say, no, you can't come in. No, we're not allowing you to come to our wedding or whatever, because of the way you treat your wife. It's really unusual, in my experience, for families to hold violent men to account. We need to start talking about survivor guilt and things that try and lock women within these violent relationships. I've mentioned the intergenerational cycling of violence, and we need to start talking about healthy relationships. I think it's really common that women don't even know what a healthy relationship looks like, and we need to provide assistance there. So just to conclude, journalism has an incredibly valuable role to play in keeping GBV in the public eye, in ensuring that communities and families blame the perpetrator and not the victim, building an understanding of the root causes, helping campaigns for action to address the root causes, and helping women experiencing GBV and their families understand more about what can be done and how to work together to live lives free from violence. Our challenge as storytellers and journalists is to embrace all of these roles. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Dukes. I think that was a great overview of some of the structural and individual factors that we face in our society, and some of the story suggestions of the missing stories for journalists, I think were very important to highlight. We have a number of questions already in the chat and in the Q&A section, and some applause as well. Maybe we can start off with our first question, which is, the stories are sensitive. How would a journalist convince the victims to speak out on a story?
Well, I think that victims are in different positions. So there are some victims who are very keen to speak out. Within all of our communities, there are women who've been victims of violence who are willing to be seen as community champions and to provide an example that helps other women. But the other thing is that I think it's important to be able to offer confidentiality. You know the tricks. You can take a photograph without showing somebody's face or identifying characteristics. You can tell a story with using a pseudonym. You can, so I think that there are ways of doing it. And also, if you tell a story where you have stories from multiple women, you can write it in a way that slightly blends each account so that you're not so clearly saying, this is exactly the story of person A, because that might lead to person A being recognizable by family or community reading the story. So that I think there are different techniques that can be used.
Great, thanks. We've also got a question from Lucy McCory, who asks, hello, Prof. How does access to post-GBV care and legal redress influence occurrence of GBV in the SA context?
Well, I think that access to post-GBV care is incredibly important, but it does depend a bit on you know, what I found is that the level of access is phenomenally different depending on where you are in the country and what type of GBV you've experienced. So it's much easier to get access to post-rape care than it is to get access to meaningful care if you're experiencing intimate partner violence. Somebody's willing to put a plaster cast on your broken arm, for example, and fill out a J88 form. But the degree to which you can access meaningful counselling and the range of assistance thereafter is really limited. We know that there are shelters, but shelters are only positioned to meet the need of quite a small proportion of the population, because it's not every woman who wants to leave the community and go into a shelter. And also shelters have all sorts of rules about whether children can go with women. And it's a particular problem for women who have teenage boys, who very often those are not allowed within shelters. You know, shelters don't actually largely are very small and don't have very many women in them. The majority of GBV care has to be provided within the community. Now, we have some areas that have really good NGOs working in that can reach out, provide counselling services. But my experience is that the majority of the community doesn't have access to that. I particularly work in the Waterberg district in Limpopo, And there are about 2 NGOs in different towns within the Waterberg that provide counselling. And for women that live in the entire rest of the district, there just isn't counselling available for women. So in a way, there isn't post-GBV care. It's a sector that we need to understand much, much more about. And again, there's a real temptation to highlight the success stories, and then you sort of think that that's what the pattern is elsewhere. And what we want to do is get some form of balance. Don't just talk to the NGO whose name you know, who's providing brilliant care, like Mosaic in the Western Cape. You know, go and think about what is provided in some of our lesser talked about districts like the Waterberg, where there really isn't very much, and start digging. Because sometimes as well, when you don't have counselling provided by NGOs, you find other things going on in the community, like GBV champions working at a small local level. And I think we need to understand more about what's possible in different settings, and to understand that it's not just all about having big NGOs who have very familiar names. But we need to have different models of how we reach out to GBV survivors and provide assistance.
Thanks, Prof. I think it was clear that when you said that for journalists it's impossible to stay neutral. We understand the setting. And I mean, we've done a whole e-course on this, but maybe if you've got any last comments, I know this is a very broad question, but maybe some highlights from a question from Chefiwa Doyoyo, who says, what role can journalists play in challenging stereotypes and promoting equality in the media? Maybe some final comments on what we can do.
Well, what I have worked with journalists over 30 years, which is how long I've been doing GBV work in South Africa. And, you know, I think journalists played such an important role in shifting things to the situation we're in, where really the silence is broken on GBV. And there is a lot of understanding of drivers of GBV. And one of the things I really appreciated about South African journalists when, you know, I'm thinking back 25 years, was the way in which people wanted to go beyond. It's not just about the numbers, although we have to talk about the numbers like the ones Begonia mentioned, because we have to understand how common GBV is, and it's very common, and these numbers exist for all of our countries. But it's really important to start saying why and putting the why out there, because it's when you start looking at what are the root causes and why do we have this problem, that you can start understanding what people can do. And if you look at that, there's something for everybody, because everybody can play a role, for example, in trying to strengthen the childhoods of children within our families and communities, trying to protect them from violence so that they can grow up with a much, much healthier mental outlook and be less vulnerable to violence victimization, perpetration later on. Everybody can embrace the project of trying to build gender equity and trying to communicate the fact that violence is totally unacceptable. And these are things that can be done from the poorest household. They don't require huge resources. They don't require high levels of education. But they're really important foundational things to do. And then everybody can take part in processes of political mobilization to lobby governments to do things around a position of women in society, to try and help with poverty eradication within communities, to try and deal with issues like substance abuse that are really, really important. And so I think trying to understand how you can work towards that is absolutely key.
Thank you. I think before we move on, there's one more question that I'd like to ask you to answer, because I think it is quite an important one. And it's a question from Gail Smith, who's asking, how do we account for compassion fatigue? Editors are not keen on GBV stories on reporting just another rape. How do we deal with that?
I think you deal with it by these survivor stories, so that if you're not talking about the last woman who got raped, you're talking about women who are standing up and have the courage to try and leave, and what their experiences are, because we need to share information about how to do this across communities. There are so many myths in communities. A myth that all men are the same. You leave one violent man, the next one will be the same. There are myths that every woman is going through the same thing. It's really important to understand, for women to understand that that's not the case. Myths that if you've got a partner and you get used to them, that you should stay with them. We need to help women understand that actually to be outraged when your partner hits you is what should be the normal, and to say no, and to be able to leave. One of the things I've seen in my work is that people are always saying, oh, it's poverty, and everybody, to the extent that women are too poor to be able to leave these violent men. Funny thing about South Africa is, with the child support grant, in very poor communities, women often have more money than men. And so very often you see these violent men are living off the woman who they're beating. And we really need to try and look beyond the easy answers, the things that are popularly spoken of, to be able to try and say no, and to help people to break out of violent relationships, understand that there is a way of moving forward and becoming a survivor, and that it's possible, and that actually thousands of women do it every year.
Thank you so much for all your perspectives and your contribution today. We really thank you very much. I think there are some questions that we didn't get to, which we will have another Q&A at the end of the session. So I think Mama Ponya can deal with some of those. But I want to say thank you very much, Professor Jukes, for making time to speak to us today. We really appreciate your input. And I think now we'll move on to the next stage of our program today, which is the panel discussion. And I'd like to invite the Frey College CEO, Mama Ponya Motsai, back to take over and introduce our speakers and moderate that session. Thanks again, Prof. Jukes.
Yes, excellent presentation there, Professor Jukes. Thank you so much for that. And definitely, you've given us some things to think about and to take the discussion forward, even now in the panel discussion, which we will start. I want to start by saying, even before I introduce the panelists, by saying that we want this part to be as interactive as possible. So I will be going through what's in the chat as we go along. Especially because we have a little bit less time. So I will be taking your questions as we go along so that we can discuss, but even more importantly, your comments as well, because we can only have a few people as panelists, but I know that there is a wealth of experience within also the participants as well. So I'll be looking out for comments as we go along. So please do put those in there. I will go back to some of your questions, which I thought were really good. Some of them I will try to also pose them to our panelists as we continue the discussion. As I mentioned, so in the gender sensitivity and how to report on gender-based violence e-course, we have 4 modules really. The idea is that participants would do a module a week. This is a course that we are hoping can be institutionalized in newsrooms as part of their HR processes, and in journalism schools as part of their core curriculum so that every journalist in the newsroom or every journalist who goes through the school has had some interactions with this kind of topic. So some of the modules in the course include understanding gender and society, exactly what Professor Jukes was talking about, that gender-based violence is very linked to violence in general in society, and violence in society is very linked to our patriarchal societies and systematic ways that women are constantly in different ways marginalized and violated. And part of making sure that we are talking about gender-based violence beyond just the incidences and moving on afterwards is having discussions also about, you know, violence in general in our societies and understanding that as journalists as well. So that's one of the modules. The other module is on legal frameworks and legal systems. So journalists, it's important that we understand what our role is there. When they say, you know, when our governments say there's a new law or there's a new policy, what is our role? What are we supposed to do? How do we keep different stakeholders accountable? And the third one, actually, let me talk about the fourth one. The fourth one is about our personal role. And this, I will talk a little bit more with my first questions to the panelists and to everyone. Our personal role in telling the story of gender-based violence and in ensuring that our newsrooms are and our workplaces are gender sensitive. And then the third one is on gender-based violence. Gender-based violence in terms of how we report on gender-based violence, but also the violence that is aimed at women journalists, particularly online. And this is the discussion that we are having today. And to help us with this discussion, we have a range of people who are part of the panel, and I'll just introduce them. So I'll start with Celestine Gachuhi. So Celestine is a celebrated Kenyan actor, speaker, gender-based violence advocate, brand influencer, and mentor. She gained widespread recognition for her captivating portrayal of Selena in the popular Maisha Magic East telenovela Selena. With her laid-back demeanor, an unwavering resilience and vibrant spirit, she has endeared herself to a large across the region. And I want to say that we know Celestine from her TikTok videos where she's talking to young schoolgirls about gender-based violence. And we invited her because the information ecosystem has changed very much. We come from a time where you know journalists used to be the holders of information, of credible, reliable information, to a time where most of the people get their information online, on social media, and journalists are not as popular there as the influencers and some of the content creator. So in trying to change narratives and trying to have an impact, we have to be intentional about creating an ecosystem where influencers, content creators, and journalists are talking together. So we start having shared values, especially around such important topics. So we are really excited to have you join us, Celestine, and talk about your experience as someone who does not necessarily have the kind of training that the other people who are in the panel have. And so we're really excited to hear of your experiences there, Celestine. And then we also have Dr. Thandi Bombi, who is a journalist and media studies lecturer at Wits Center for Journalism. Dr. Bombi completed her master's and PhD research through Rose University. She has gained extensive teaching, learning, and research experience in her different roles in journalism departments around South Africa. Her research focused on political listening as an ethical response to gender-based violence. She interrogated how narratives of femicide, rape, and intimate partner violence are normalized in public discourse, including in the courts and the media and social talk. The study also interrogates the calls for those affected to use their voices to speak out against such violence as an anecdote. The thesis argued that a political and social shift needs to take place from expecting those who speak out to a different, more radical form of listening in arenas where gender-based violence is managed, discussed, and reported on. So welcome, Dr. Bombi, and we are excited to have you join us as well. We also have Patricia Kesisi, who is the managing editor at Minority Africa, which is an online publication that tells African stories but is based in Kampala, Uganda. Kesisi was a former content editor at Bird, a news agency by Africa No Filter, and has contributed to several publications, including Foreign Policy. She's also a media literacy trainer and a DW media trainer. She has conducted workshops on media and its intersection with social justice with organizations such as the French Embassy in Uganda and the Fruen Initiative. Currently, she's completing a media and communication master's at Liverpool John Moores University. Welcome, Patricia, and we're excited to have you with us. Last but not least, in our panel, we have Miriam Iliemi, who is a Nigerian journalist with over 5 years of experience on the development desk at the Premium Times, one of Nigeria's most popular publication. She reports on public health, gender, and education with a strong track record of highlighting underreported realities in rural and marginalized communities. She is a fellow at the African Health Communications Fellowship and an alumna of the Media EIS Fellowship, a collaborative project of breakthrough action in Nigeria. She's also part of the Nigeria Center of Disease Control, and amongst others. Miriam is also a recipient of the Maman Marshall Scholarship for Women in Journalism and has been nominated for the 2024 Nigeria Healthcare Excellence Award in prevention in the Prevent Epidemics category, which is empowered by Nigeria Health Watch. Thank you so much for joining us, Miriam, and thank you for everyone. So just as we get started, and I think this is a very important question to start with, and it has come up throughout the webinar in different ways. I think in getting started with our panelists, but I would like everybody to contribute to this question, even in the chat. In getting started, my first question would be on the role of media in reporting on gender-based violence. I ask this because this is not a common understanding or an understanding. We do not share the same understanding in different newsrooms, and in different newsrooms, different people have the same different understanding of what their role is here. When we were developing the e-course, we had consultations with newsrooms and journalism schools, and there was this discussion about how, part of the reasons why newsrooms often, they would cover if there's a case about on gender-based violence, they would cover it and then move on. For many of us, for example, if you ask many people, in Nigeria, the girls have not been abducted by militia and other groups since the Chibok girls, just because those stories are not as widely reported as that one was, and media moved on after that. So one of the issues when we were speaking to our colleagues was that, we just don't have the time. They are more important. There are other issues that we need to prioritize, and we have other issues that we need to meet. We have other concerns that we need to do, to look at. And so my question is, in the time where newsrooms are inundated with all sorts of pressures, including financial sustainability, including what is happening on social media, where the share for attention has dwindled, what is the role of media and journalism and storytellers in reporting on gender-based violence? And I ask you to consider this also with thinking about it in terms of how in journalism we are taught to be objective or to divorce ourselves from issues and just report from a distance. So, and I want us to think about it in that lens again. So I want to start with our panelists, but if you can also, in the participants, if you can share your thoughts on what you think your role is and your newsroom's role is when it comes to reporting consistently and in a quality manner on gender-based violence. But I'll just start with our panelists, and I will start, Miriam, I'll start with you, given the work that you do, which focus specifically on gender issue and health issues. What do you think the role of media, of journalists, and now even storytellers on social media, what is our role in reporting and telling stories of gender-based violence?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I like that Professor GQ's, Professor Rachel session has actually set the stage for, this conversation. So if we are looking at the role of journalism or the role of the media when it comes to reporting violence against women, I think one thing we need to first do is to center our mind to know that as media, we are also partner in prevention and accountability. Once we believe that as journalists, we can do stories in such a way that would, spotlight issues and also prevent issues of gender-based violence. How can we do this? I think the first thing is that we need to move away from reporting event-based, because of course it's our responsibility to report when there is a case of rape, when there is a breaking news, that of course we need to spotlight them. So we need to start moving away from that and then looking at investigating issues, holding perpetrators to account, and also looking at the system. What are those laws? For instance, in Nigeria, we have the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. We have to link crimes to these, legal provisions in such a way that when we highlight them, we are trying to say that this crime, there is a law that backs it, and this person should not go scot-free. So once we are able to start spotlighting issues like this, we move away from the event-based, and we are also playing a role in areas of accountability. And then Professor Rachel, in her presentation, she highlighted that we have to look, beyond headline. And I think it is actually true. But for some of us in Nigeria, for instance, sometimes the headline is even the first step to start calling media organizations to order that, no, when you're reporting on violence against women, your headline has to be one that is sensitive to the issue. So that's why gender sensitivity is very important. There are situations where the headline can, be romanticizing the crime in a way that gives that probably you are shifting the blame to the victim in a situation where you are saying, woman beaten to death by husband because she disrespected her husband. That way, if you write your headline in such a way, you are indirectly saying that, okay, it is fine for the husband to beat the wife. So I think the headline is actually the first thing to do when you are, calling, you're holding perpetrators accountable. So another thing, when we're talking about promoting prevention, I feel like Professor Rachel has already mentioned the drivers, when it comes to the trauma that, most of these men, they grew up in homes where they've been traumatized. So these drivers, while they are important for us to report on them, I think it is also important for us to emphasize reporting on prevention, speaking with women who have actually healed, like we tell their stories from how they were able to heal from their experiences, maybe those that suffered intimate partner violence. So we can start reporting from how they, were able to regain their confidence as women. And also we can speak with, I feel like an unpopular opinion is the fact that we're already having men who are advocating and joining organizations that work on gender-based violence. I feel if we start getting men to also speak on these issues, we try to, we take away the conversation away from the fact that violence against women is just a woman issue. We are already highlighting that it is our issue. It's like a collective responsibility for everyone. Yeah. So because for every case of violence against women, you will likely get to see a man, because disproportionately the cases of violence against women, it is perpetrated by men. So for every case you see a man. So I feel like getting men involved as well in conversations, men that are advocates, that are activists, getting them to speak will also, kind of elicit some form of behavioral change among those that still have this mindset that women are like properties, women are like tools that they can, harass, that they can force. Because of course, when we look at violence against women, especially on the part of men, most of them it is because of men feel they have the power and control over women. They feel like, yes, I have this power. They feel they can, break a woman anytime they like. So if we're able to start getting men to also talk about why they are advocating or they are joining organizations that work on women or that are advocating against violence, that way we're also contributing to the conversation, and we're also being partners in prevention and accountability.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for that, Miriam. And there's something that you said there that I really liked about how the role of media is not just, it's also highlighting and spotlighting and raising awareness, but it's connecting the dots. If I may paraphrase what you're saying, when you're saying, connecting the dots about the crime and the law, between the crime and the law, and all of how the intersectionality of different areas around gender-based violence. Thank you for that. And we'll come back to some of the points that you mentioned. I just want to go to Patricia now. And Patricia, if you can answer this question about the role of journalism, also talking about the issue of, and I know that, journalists particularly get very nervous whenever you mention activism in the newsroom. But I know that Minority Africa has explicitly said we are going to tell stories that deal with certain groups, communities, and advocating for their issues and telling their stories. So Patricia, if you can just tell us your thoughts on what you think the role of journalism is in reporting on gender-based violence. But if you can really speak to the issue of, at what point do we say, actually, this can be a thing where journalists can say, I will be an activist of this issue in the newsroom, because this is not like any other issue. This is something that we all have to draw a line in the sand and say, actually, we have a standpoint on this issue and we will fight in this way in regards to this issue. Patricia?
Thank you. Thank you for this. So for me, when it comes to what we can do as journalists, I like, there is an approach. I don't know if any of you have come across it. It is a model I like using. The model is called the iceberg model. I don't know if any of you have come across it. It is a systems thinking model, but this is a model I like to apply to many of the stories I interact with. So this model looks at like an iceberg. So when you look at an iceberg, you'll see that tip. But we all know from the famous Titanic that what you see at the surface, there is something bigger at the bottom. So usually we shall see something will happen, an event. So a woman, say, will be, say, raped. And then, but what this rape is not something that is happening in isolation. There are so many things that are happening that have enabled this event to happen. And so what most of us do as journalists, when something like that happens, we shall all jump on the bandwagon and talk about, oh, this woman was raped, and it's so bad, the family is going through this, and this is happening, and people are shocked, and then we shall stop there. And then we miss an important opportunity. So what happens is, whenever we come across a story about a gender violence issue, it is important to look at trends and patterns. Have there been other cases like that in this area, in this country? And then after looking at trends, and you've been able to identify those trends, it's important to look at now the systemic structures that support these patterns. For example, what do the laws in that country look like? What are the inheritance laws like? What are generally the laws, the systems that are supporting the reason why these patterns are happening? And then after that, you have to look at something else that is even deeper. What are some of you look at the mental models. What are those mental models that are supporting these systems? So, like, for example, beliefs. Beliefs or myths that people use, stereotypes that people use to usually to support these systems. Women, it's her fault this happened, or as a man I should be able to keep my woman in check, you know. And then sometimes in some societies, when something like that happens, you'll see people saying, oh, it's a family matter, I shouldn't be able to take it, shouldn't be able to go to police, you shouldn't be able to report it. And once we've identified those things, when we are reporting these stories, if you report on this incident and dig deeper into the patterns, into the systemic structures, into the mental models that are going on in our systems, you'll find that at the end of the day, you're producing this wholesome story that people are able to actually look at in depth. People realize that it's not just a rape of a woman, but it's this whole structure that has been supporting these things that are happening in our society. So about activism, yes. So we believe at Minority Africa that today we are lucky that we have all these resources around us. So we have all these journalism approaches that journalists can apply in their storytelling, depending on the story. So for us as Minority Africa, in all the stories we do, we apply most of these approaches, and sometimes we also mix them up. But one of the approaches we always apply is something called advocacy journalism. So we take a stand and say no to GBV. We don't. So whichever story we shall write, you'll be able to tell it in a story that we are against GBV. And how we do that, of course, we have to uphold our journalism principles, because we cannot. There is a way you can make that stand and still do your job as a journalist and report on that story, but to report it. So, for example, let me give an example. There's been a woman has been beaten. So we shall not say this woman was beaten because. So, for example, we want to take an interview from the perpetrator in that case, because we know the perpetrator will most probably defend himself. I came home and she did not attend to me, or she did this. So because we know that, so for some stories where we know the perpetrator could defend himself, and we will not give you an interview. So we will talk to the community, we will talk to organizations that work with GBV, we'll talk. So we are very selective on who we interview for stories, for most of our stories. We are very selective on the type, even the writers themselves. If, for example, one incident we were once doing a story about FGM in Liberia, but the writer was a man. And because he was a man, there are certain things he was not able to, one, articulate, but also two, the kinds of questions he was interviewing, putting forward to his sources were they were a bit problematic. So we asked this person, one, get someone you can write the story with, a woman, and let this woman be the one to do these interviews. Especially when it comes to a sensitive issue like FGM, where women may not be comfortable with another man. We told the person, get a female whom you can work with, and then And once he got another person to co-write the story with, the story took a different shape. We're able to see these interviews, we're able to see these questions answered, we're able to see all these other things that he was not able to see just because he's not part of that community. He doesn't know what it really means to undergo FGM, or to be under that scare that I could go under FGM, or if I'm not, I will not be accepted by my community. So yes, we take that stand. But like I said, it's a very thin line. You have to tread carefully, because you don't want also to be labeled as biased, for example, in a negative way. Because we are biased, we take this stand, but then we still have to uphold our principles as journalists. Thank you.
Very interesting there, what you say about if you know, you would perhaps not interview the perpetrator. And I think I would be very keen to hear what other people maybe in the chat have to say about that. And I say that because I think as we're doing interviews, one of the things that some of the activists said was that let's not have these conversations in silos. Let's also engage the people who are perpetrators, and obviously also the people who are perpetrators are everyday people, right? They're not like monsters who are in a corner somewhere. So let's engage them. Let's hear. But then maybe the question is, how do we do that in a way where we're not promoting harmful thoughts, but we are giving people a space to understand and have a conversation where we can challenge, because if we're not even listening, we can't challenge them and say, actually, no, that's not how this works. So some thoughts there from everyone. I'll come to the chat, but I just want to go to our last two panelists quickly. Thandi, can I ask you to come next? And Thandi, if you can speak just in your intro, if you can speak also about, there's been quite a few mentions of relying on the survivors for stories, and I know your thesis dealt with some of that. So if you could also give us your thought in that as part of your response for our role in all of this.
Thank you for having me. In terms of relying on survivors for stories, but with just looking at the role of the journalist, I think that the first thing is to understand that journalists and newsrooms they don't just exist outside of the societies that they're a part of. So within these newsrooms and the experiences of the journalists themselves, as you mentioned, also the violence against women journalists, the societal factors impact them too, and that also impacts the way in which they tell stories and the kinds of stories that they prioritize, as well as the voices that they listen to. So I think that what Professor Jukes mentions about reframing the woman in these stories from like just these victims, these bodies, into people who, there's lots of other stories where the people who have experienced the violence have overcome some of it, or have strategies that they can relay that information. And it's also important for, when the journalist is like reflecting on their own role, to also understand like how their ideas and beliefs can also reperpetuate the problem. So for instance, if just on Miriam's example about the headlines, one of the things that came up for me was the idea of romanticizing the problem, like in ways like talking about gender-based violence or intimate partner violence as crimes of passion, right? So if the journalists themselves has the ways in which they talk about and they express the ideas around gender-based violence is important. The language, the myths. I mean, we've mentioned quite a few of the things here already. So I think even understanding it from that perspective will also change the way in which they engage with their sources. Understanding that you're not just looking for a, a body where you can like talk about all the things that this woman experienced or all the violence that was enacted upon her. You actually, there are people who are talking, and it's not about just looking at the story in terms of what leads or what bleeds. It's more about understanding how to tell a different story. I really like the idea of the iceberg model because it helps us interrogate even deeper. And just to add to that model, I would say have also a reflective exercise where you also understand how your framing and shaping of the story, who you choose as a source, and what you highlight when you are doing the headlines also shapes the way in which the public engages with the matter, and also shapes the way in which the public understands the matter. In societies where culturally, violence is like embedded in how men and women behave, the role of the journalist has to become an activist role, because I think that one can say that there are other ways to behave, and the idea of framing the stories as these are the other ways that we can behave. These are the other ways we can show love. Instead of showing love through violence, we can show love in these ways, is also part of that activism.
Yeah, it is. Thank you. Thank you for that. And then quickly, just Celestine, coming to you, and I think if you can also give us your thoughts, particularly given the space that you tell the stories of gender-based violence on, a space like TikTok, which is very fast, where there's a lot of competition, where there's a lot of immediately a lot of opposing views. And so for you in a space where there's such competition for attention, what do you think the role of storytellers such as yourself, influencers such as yourself, is when it comes to how we talk about gender-based violence?
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm glad to be here. For these conversations on gender-based violence. As an actor, as an influencer, and as a person that is, very active on social media, I think first of all, before I mention social media, maybe I could add to the media houses. I think one of the things we see is a headline, it's trending maybe maximum 2 days of, reporting how a woman was killed or how a woman was beheaded. And, mostly what I've seen in Kenya, it's like all of us, the public, the media houses, we just see it and we're in shock and we're afraid, but we don't see what happens beyond the shock, beyond the, these terrible acts. And I think if it were possible, if the media houses created a space or, a program to create awareness, because the chief speaker has just said and mentioned that many women don't even know what a healthy relationship is. And I think the most simplest things that we are oblivious of are the most important things. Let's go to the roots. Let's teach women how to love themselves, how to know what a healthy relationship is. And if we had such created rooms, let's not treat this news as just any other news, because this is an issue of life and death. So I'm thinking if we had a media house that really had a space for this awareness, for gender-based violence awareness, for, let's say, people that can come and teach the public on issues. Let's start from the simplest of things, of what gender-based violence is, what types are they, what's that one thing that happens to us as women, or even small girls and small boys, but it's just, we are just oblivious as a society, because we were born, found it happening, but truly to the core, it's a type of gender-based violence. The speaking, the sexual assault of, the abuses, because I believe it just that doesn't happen. It starts from somewhere, and it's cultivated until now. It has the roots to do the worst of the worst, the killings, the raping. Yeah, so let me go to social media and using my brand, really being a voice to speaking about these issues, which are very sensitive. And I don't like backlash from mostly men, because I think they don't understand we are not fighting men. It's an issue that we need also men to come in and fight. We are fighting the gender-based violence, fighting men. And just having a woman standing up and saying gender-based violence is bad, we can't handle it, we need to have many people coming up. The questions from men are always like, we don't see you talking about men that go through the GBV. But I'm like, as a woman, I can only do so much to speak for men. So also having men coming on board, being allies, and also speaking for themselves, because there are men that are going through the same thing, but unfortunately women are the highest percentage to go through gender-based violence. So me using my social media is very important, because I believe I have an influence, and I believe I've made at least, even if it's a 1% change of creating awareness and bringing people to speaking, having people that can help educate. The education I was saying before, us having, because you have a voice and you can bring someone like a psychologist, someone from a hospital, connecting the public to maybe safe houses. How can they get help? So I'm literally a voice to create awareness and to stand against gender-based violence, and using my resources to make sure that people are educated on gender-based violence. They can get help, they can get, for example, if I partnered with a hospital and just tell them, you can have this, you can have a psychologist, and maybe talk to a hospital and be like, can you do a subsidized rate for anyone that comes, from us engaging, so that they can have therapy. And this has really been effective, and it's something that we will continue doing, so that before we deal with the whole someone has died, can we start from the roots, from the smallest, and the things that are looked at and we are oblivious of, so that people can know what exactly gender-based violence is, and how can we avoid it to get to being killed, or how can we tell women or show women that you can get out, having even survivor stories, success stories of survivors, so that if anyone is in the situation, they can see a woman telling their stories in my podcast, and they know, wow, I can do it, I can move, I can start again. It's not the end of the world. And yeah, this is what we do, and I'm so excited to be so much.
Thank you, Celestine. And it's interesting what you say there about men coming on to say that, well, we get abused too, because that's something that happens very often, where there seems to be people who want to diverge from the issue when the media starts focusing on this. And I think one of the things that came through, certainly, I remember we did an interview with Lisa Vetten as part of the e-course. And one of the things that she mentioned was that when we start reporting on the different areas that affect gender-based violence, when we start reporting on them all the time and not just wait when there's an issue, there's space for everything. The problem with such arguments is that they often come when you start talking about Mary was killed, and then in that context a man comes and says, well, we are also, then it doesn't land very well, and if some people might feel like we are not being listened to, but that's not the time to bring in those issues. And I think this goes also with when we've been talking about, you know, interrogating violence in our communities as a whole. Such stories would do very well as we carry them throughout consistently, and they don't just come out only when we have a crisis, but if we get into a culture of talking about these issues in our media overall and the different aspects of them, then there's different room for people to have their stories without feeling like it's taking away from something else. Thank you so much for bringing that. And I want to quickly mention some comments, and then I'm going to hand over to our panelists to just give their closing remarks, because I know we are a little bit out of time and I want us to close. But I want to acknowledge Lillian's comment in the chat group. Lillian, thank you so much for sharing your comment and offering to also share your story with our media colleagues. So Lillian is saying she herself suffered gender-based violence. She's a survivor, and she took when I took power back and reported him. So let me just start. I'm a victim of gender-based violence, suffered in the toxic marriage for 13 years, and when I took back power and reported him, I was casted out by my family and friends, and I was told that I should not report him. I experienced this from police too, that I should consider it as he is my husband. But this man beat me sexually abused me, cheated on me, and exposed me to disease, but he was still protected. I'm in Kenya, Nairobi, and happy to tell my story to educate and save other women. Thank you for sharing that, Lillian. And I see Celestine is saying she's happy to have a conversation with you. And then Adenitan says that one of the challenges of reporting on GBV is the disposition of victims. I've handled a case where the victim, who herself invited me to her story, denies ever talking to me about it and accused me of attempting to destabilize her marriage. So I'll go through some of these questions, and I'll give certain of our panel speakers to address them as we conclude the meeting. But I see there were some other comments, most of them sharing that they agree with what has been noted by our panelists. But so I don't see any other question. So I'll go back to our panelists, and I'm going to start with you, Patricia, because I would like you to maybe also respond to this. Patricia, if maybe in just your closing remarks, as we talk about the kind of stories that we want to see, the stories that we want to see when reporting on gender-based violence, I would like, Patricia, if you could speak to this, because what Adenitan is talking about here has many layers, right? Because yes, perhaps the person was, at the moment, they felt like they wanted to talk to you. This is why we often, when we do training on gender sensitivity and reporting on sensitive topics, we also talk about informed consent, where the well-being of the person is more important than your story, right? And of course, if they go back after you've published and everything was fine, that's a different matter. But for me, when I hear this, I see someone who's scared, because obviously you at that point you might have been feeling in a certain mindset, and now you're in a different mindset. And I think they may be, for the journalists, even though you had permission, I think there's a need to be very compassionate and put the needs of the other person and not be part of victimizing them. So Patricia, if you could just give us your thoughts there and maybe your closing remarks. You're muted, Patricia.
Sorry. So thank you so much. Actually, the issue on consent was what I was going to speak about as my closing remarks. So it's like you read my mind. So we once had an incident at Minority Africa where we published a video story, and then years later, maybe 3 years later, after this story had been shared thousands of times, one of the sources faced backlash, and the person was forced to run out of the country. Their life was turned around in an instant just because of particular laws that were being discussed at that moment. So, and that forced us to rethink our consent, the way we asked for consent from sources. So what happens for most media houses? Consent is basically, oh, we would like to do an interview. Are you comfortable with this? We would like to take a photo. Are you comfortable with this? And when the source says yes, then they go ahead and do it. But what we decided to do, we realized that sometimes sources do not know the impact of what the story could have. So what we do, one of the things we have in our consent forms is, as long as the story has not been published yet, you can withdraw your consent and we shall respect it. But then also too, we shall go ahead and tell you the impact of what this story could do. So for example, we shall, if you're doing a story, so we could tell you, number one, if you choose to use your real name, or if it's a video story, if you choose to use your face in the story, this is what can happen. The perpetrator, the person who has been abusing you, can come after you. The police can do this. The community can do this. All these things. And then we also tell you that even when it does not happen now, it can happen in future. That's why you come in with knowledge, full knowledge. But also there are certain stories, even when the source is ready to give their consent, where the source is, I'm ready, I know all these things, but we feel that if this person's story comes out with their face and everything from experience, this person it will not be good for this person. We shall still keep you anonymous, because we know the impact of what you're trying to do. In that moment, you can be geared up. Maybe you have the support behind you, or maybe you're just so angry or emotional, and then you make those decisions. But then it's our job to say, okay, let's hold off on this story, or let's publish the story, but give this person their privacy. But the other thing is, there is another approach to journalism we always employ in certain situations. It's called trauma-informed journalism. Informed journalism puts the safety of the sources first. So what do we do? For example, as we are doing a story, we shall always share, which is not conventional. We're not, actually, for most media houses and people in school, they say you're not supposed to do that. But as we are writing your story, we shall always share these drafts with you. Before we publish the story, we shall give you that draft to go through. If there is anything you're not comfortable with sharing, because you can share something in one moment, and then after some time, when you think about it, you're like, okay, I don't want to have this one out in public. So we give you a chance to actually go through the final draft. If it's a video, the final video clip before we publish it. Also, we shall, or for some of our stories, we shall actually put resources. So, for example, we've built a resource bank for people in Uganda. The resource bank has telephone numbers of legal people who can help you, police stations, departments, shelters, different places you can go to seek help at the end. So at the end of the story, would leave you a bigger person, because we believe that the role we do when it comes to reporting these stories, it's also a healing process for you, the source, but also for us as journalists. So we always employ most of these techniques to make sure that when we publish a final story, the impact is positive, other than publish a story and then you regret, oh my God, I shouldn't have published this story because this person is now in danger and things like that. So it's a process. And that's why for some of these stories, we take long to publish. So you can pitch to us a story, do your story, and we publish the story, say 5 months later, because we are being cautious. We don't want backlash on the writer or on the journalist or the source. Yes, thank you. So let's keep that in mind, that consent is beyond just yes and no. These sources have to know the actual impact of them sharing their stories. They have to be aware and they have to make an informed decision. But we should also use our discretion as media practitioners, because we have that experience, to be able to decide how this story comes out and the best way to bring it out without any negative or less thunder around the source or the journalists. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Really good points there about, even about the impact that we think about. What impact will this have? Because I think sometimes in the fight to have views and audiences, and with the pressures that are on journalists, we forget the impact and why we are telling these stories and what we would want them to do. And some of our stories end up actually doing harm to the community and to the sources who spoke to us. Thank you for that. And I see Lucy there says that excellent, bravo, especially in social media world, where once a story is posted, it can never 100% be deleted. So making sure that the person is protected and their best interests are thought of at the beginning, very important. Thank you, Patricia. And then I'll go to you also, to you, Miriam, in your closing remarks. And Miriam, in your closing remarks, if you can also just talk about, there was somebody who in the beginning had a question about finding or helping women to feel comfortable enough to share their stories while still protecting them. They were struggling with getting women who are willing to talk to them. Your thoughts on that as well, Miriam, as you give your closing remarks.
Hello, yeah. So thank you so much. I feel that one important thing journalists must know is that it is important to be empathetic. Like, you have to show empathy when you're reporting on any form of violence against women. So, for instance, you have approached a survivor, just like it's also related to the issue of consent. You have to let them understand that, of course, this is okay. I would like to cite an example. I remember 3 years ago, I did a special report, and it was something like different from maybe sexual violence. It was more about financial independence, how lack of financial independence is forcing women to remain with abusive partner. So I remember that I had to like speak with 3 women who are, currently facing domestic violence. And there was one who was already prepared to leave, but there was this question about where will I go to, where is shelter and everything. So if we go to meet these women, with the mindset, of course, we're not promising them that as journalists, we're going to give them money, we're going to help them out of their marriage, but we need to make them comfortable. We need to let them know that this is the issue. If you're able to speak up, we can always protect you. I remember the story, we had to use a pseudonym, we didn't use their actual name. So there are situations like that where women, are allowed to speak without having to, give their full identity in such a way that protects them. So we have seen cases of eventually, for instance, in Lagos, we have the Center Against Sexual-Based, Gender-Based Violence, where this agency works with journalists to make sure that the survivor gets justice. And in fact, they've recorded some, fantastic cases of perpetrators being persecuted in no time. So with collaborating with agencies like this, those people are, that's like their focus. Those people are able to also meet with this survivor in a way that makes them more comfortable, to speak, about their challenges, and they are protected. I know it can be, it's easier said than done, Yeah, it is easier said than done. But when you want to report on issues like this, we have to be empathetic. We can't emphasize that enough. And another thing to that I would like to say is that to person who, for women to feel more comfortable to share their stories, we need to understand that we have to look at the issues particularly, especially I highlighted initially about the laws and the international treaties. We can also serve as, the form of education to these women and also to the public, for them to understand the laws that are available to back them up, for them to understand that there are international treaties to back them up. And if we are looking at prevention, we don't have to wait for the next case of violence to happen before we start reporting. I remember 2 years ago on the Maputo Protocol, because in Nigeria, it is signed, it has been ratified, but there's still an issue with domestication and implementation. So I remember Maputo Protocol clock 20 years, 2 years ago, and I had to do like an analysis, and I was able to like present the available data on cases of violence against women, and also look at the provisions of Maputo Protocol, that if Nigeria is able to implement, these are the provisions, these are those issues that women are guided on, So I feel like if we're able to look at these laws, and it involves journalists also understanding what exactly these laws are about, for journalists to really understand what is the issue of GBV. And then I would also like to say that recently somebody made a comment about the fact that when you start talking about GBV, men are the first people to say, oh, what about us? What about us? We need to, actually identify this, because even in newsrooms, we have seen cases of colleagues, or even me myself, when we present that we want to do stories on gender-based violence, and they ask questions about, what about us? Gender is not only limited to women. So that's why I always emphasize, if we're talking about women and girls, violence against women and girls, we have to be specific. We have to continue emphasizing on violence against women and girls. So, because in the actual sense, gender is for both male and female, And I also highlighted in my initial point about the fact that we also need to carry people along. We can play a huge role when it comes to behavioral change, when it comes to eliciting some form of behavioral change. So with all these points, I would just like to, leave all these points, because they are very critical when it comes to looking at the role of media as partner for prevention and accountability when it comes to violence against women and girls. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, for that point. And yes, and it's an important thing that that you mentioned there about the definition of gender, because gender, there are different genders, but it's important that we recognize that only certain genders usually face violence because of their genders. It's not often that you will find that men are being persecuted because of their gender. It's women, it's trans people, it's lesbians, it's people in the sexual minorities. So it's important that we also understand why gender-based violence and who that applies to, because often it's not men who are violated because of their gender. Thank you for that, Miriam, and excellent points there. I'll finish with you, Celestine. Celestine, if you can just maybe with your closing remarks, give us some thoughts on how we tell stories of gender-based violence on social media in a way that actually resonates with people and they don't quickly scroll past.
So thank you again. So I think in the world of social media, the laws of the media houses also apply, because let's say we can't say we are a media house, but you are media in a way, because people listen to you, you have influence. So we ought to be very careful of what we say, how we tell stories of people. And I think I've really liked the fact that Samantha said the impact of the story should be positive, and just making sure we first look at the safety of the person that is sharing the story, because to be honest, they've been through the whole GBV, and now if they're coming to share, let's be very vigilant, inform them of the impact of what sharing the story is, so that they are informed and that they should be in the right state of making the decision to share. And also, I think I really love telling success stories, because if you're coming to share, if really it's fresh, can we have someone that is educated in that aspect, like a psychologist, a therapist, so that we can have the first priority is the survivor. But if they're okay, that's fine. But really, let's have a positive impact after sharing the story. And also the wording also is very important, how we articulate the story, how we shoot the story. It's a whole, it's around, it's not a black and white. It has to work with the person that is sharing the story. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Celestine. I love that, what you said about you love telling success stories. And this is something that has come out from different speakers today, about how we don't want to just focus on what is wrong, but because this is another reason why people have become news fatigued and they're not engaging with news anymore, because it's so negative and it leaves people feeling so helpless. But if we can also have stories where people feel like, oh, actually, there's light at the end of the tunnel, this can be solved, there's something that can be done. Because news and journalism in particular is meant to reflect society. And society is not just one aspect, the negative aspects. Like Prof. Rachel Jukes was saying, there's a lot of people doing a lot of work, and in some instances, it is helping. So part of the story that we need to tell is that story as well, of what is working, what is helping, how can we learn from that, and how can we duplicate that. And with that, I'm going to end it there. So I see there's more comments of people agreeing in the chat with what has been said, and thank you for that. I just wanted to take one last question which was posed, but we didn't get a chance, about how do we report on gender-based violence without influence of our own biases and emotions. And I think that Ronse asked that question, and I think that applies to the issue of biases, and some people have spoken about biases. The best thing to do is first acknowledge your biases. If you feel a certain way towards women in that communities, towards trans people, towards, you need to know and understand that. And you need to be honest with those biases. If you feel like you cannot remove them, you need to have honest conversations with your editor to say, actually, I feel like I struggle with our community and it's impacting my work in this way and this way. But it's really important that you be honest about your own biases. If you are a man journalist and you are the mindset that women should be seen and not heard, you need to be aware of that and acknowledge that, because it will impact how you report on gender-based violence and how you report in general. And that's something you should deal with urgently.
Sorry, can I add to what you just said about reporting without your bias, something like that? So I think one thing we must first to know is that we need, when we are approaching any survivor, we are trying to report, just like you mentioned, we have to first acknowledge the biases that we have, and we need to first admit, and acknowledge that we are first human. So if we know that we are first human, especially if we are female journalists reporting on violence against another woman, we need to first understand that we are first human and it can happen to us, number one. And we need to first know that being human first and then journalist second, that way we can be objective in our reporting. We might, because of course, if you are the gender reporter on your desk, we don't expect somebody who reports politics 100% to come and do your job for you. So I think being gender reporter means you have to identify that your biases, you have to put them aside whatsoever, or you have to find a way to make sure that you are educated, you are reorientated in a way that it does not distort your work. So we must not lose our humanity. Being a journalist is second, and being human is first. Being empathetic, being respectful towards survivors is very important. So that's the contribution I wanted to make.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Miriam. And with that, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for those of you who are still here. I think in rounding up the discussion, I think one of the main things that came out from all the speakers actually is let's go deeper. There's so much that we are not reporting on to help our audiences understand the issues and how we can change and what needs to change, that we as the media industry need to report on. And there's so many stories that we are not telling that we need to tell. We need to be clear that we have a role to play here to change our societies and make it safer for everyone. And in doing that, we must go deeper. Patricia mentioned it as the ICE model. Let's go to the ICE model and talk about those issues that impact violence against women, gender-based violence, but are never spoken about. Let's talk about the causes of violence. Let's talk about how violent our societies are in nature and how we've normalized violence in other areas. Let's talk about what laws exist and where they are being kept. Let's keep our different stakeholders accountable, but let's go deeper. I think if I could summarize the discussions that came out from today, it's let's go deeper. Let's not just tell one story. Let's tell the multiple stories of violence against women and children. Let's tell stories of success. Let's talk to the people we don't normally talk to. And let's do that consistently and not make it an event-based thing. And we really hope that this is something that we will see from different people. We will be starting with the pilot of the e-course, but as soon as, I know some people mentioned in the chat group, when will it be available in our countries? As soon as we've completed the pilot phase and we've had some feedback on the initial from the initial group, we will be very keen to make this as accessible to everyone as possible, because we do think that it's important. And so we will be in touch with the development of the course. Thank you everyone for everybody who joined. Thank you so much to our panel speakers. Dr. Bombi had to leave very urgently, but thank you to her. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Celestine. And with that, I'll hand over back to Bridget to just close.
Thank you, Mama Ponya, and thank you to everyone that joined our webinar on the role of journalists in reporting gender-based violence. I think from our keynote address, the one takeaway is we need to be societal change agents. It's impossible for us to remain neutral, and we've thanked the panelists. I think also just to thank all your contributions in the chat, and bringing your perspectives from across the continent. We hope that your voices and survivor testimonies can help to make the changes that we need in our society to make the lives and safety of women more in Africa. So thank you for joining us. We will make the recording available. Thank you again, and stay in touch. Bye.